Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Countywide Community Wildfire Protection Plan informational session. My name is Tui Hua. I'm with the Department of Regional Planning, and today's information session is, as it's stated, it is a quick lunchtime informational session to introduce you to the project. We will have subsequent workshops where we will get into more detailed discussions on the plan, as well as opportunities for very detailed interactive feedback. For today's session, we'll be presenting the information. We'll have a couple of polls to collect just some baseline information, and then we will have, if time permits, we'll have a brief Q&A at the end. So if you do have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to place them into the chat box. And again, pending time, we will get to those questions. So with that, let's get started. Next slide. With today's meeting, we will do an introduction of the project team. We'll go through an overview of the Integrated Wildfire Safety Program. We'll touch upon the Community Wildfire Protection Plan and exactly what the countywide CWPP is intended to cover. And we'll round out the meeting with discussions on the next steps. Next slide. For our introductions, next slide. The project team, the core project team consists of LA County Planning, LA County Fire Department, and our consultant, DUDEC. Again, my name is Tui Hua from LA County Planning. Unfortunately, our LA County Fire Department counterparts were not able to join us today, but they will be at future workshops. And Scott Eckhart from DUDEC is with me for today's presentation. Next slide. Next slide. The Integrated Wildfire Safety Program was crafted as an umbrella to connect the various policy and plan programs that address wildfire prevention protection. There are a number of other emergency response programs and plans that the county administers, namely to address emergencies as they occur or after they've occurred in post-disaster recovery efforts. However, the Integrated Wildfire Safety Program is intended to focus on those various plans and elements that really work at the beginning stages of before a fire starts, how we can work to protect communities against wildfire. The general plan safety element is an element of the broader general plan for the entire unincorporated LA County area. It sets the vision for development and conservation in the unincorporated areas of Los Angeles County, where the safety element namely provides for the goals and the policies on how we protect our community residents from natural, climate-induced, as well as some human-made hazards. The Countywide Wildfire Risk Assessment is an assessment that we are developing, which uses modeling tools that takes into account factors such as topography, weather, and fuels that collectively contribute to the wildfire risk environment. And so that technical document will inform us as to the various risk levels depending on those factors that I had just mentioned. The Unified Land Management Plan is intended to be a strategic document that outlines the tools that the county is able to employ to manage the vegetation within the unincorporated areas in order to manage the wildfire risks. And that particular Unified Land Management Plan also takes into consideration that we have complementary goals as well too for biological resource protections. The Countywide Community Wildfire Protection Plan is intended as a community-based document that provides for the more geographic or community-focused specific level strategies that enables community members to actively participate in protecting their communities from wildfire. And we'll get into the detailed overview of that in just a moment. Overall, the Integrated Wildfire Safety Program's goals include assessing the wildfire risk in the county. So as I mentioned, it does take a look at it at the county-wide level, while the plans and the documents that we will be producing address the unincorporated areas for which we have jurisdiction over. The Wildfire Risk Assessment does acknowledge that there are adjacency considerations with other jurisdictions. The second goal of this program is to balance the fuels reduction with the ecosystem needs. So we acknowledge that there are fuels that contribute to wildfire risk. Those need to be addressed. However, we do also need to protect the ecosystem at the same time. Los Angeles County has an amazing diversity within our bioresources, both plant and animals, and they are subject to wildfire risk. And finally, we want to provide community-focused fire protection, so involving community members who are within those fire risk areas and surrounding the fire risk areas as well too, to enable your participation in protecting the community against fire. Next slide. We have a few interactive polls that we'd like to solicit your feedback on. The first poll here, the first question includes, do you live or work in a high wildfire risk area? You can go ahead and select one of the three options. This allows us to kind of understand the participants, where you're from, and then also for question number 2, whether or not you are familiar with wildfire regulations. There's quite a bit of information out there, both from the state level as well as the local level, on wildfire regulations and best management practices. So it allows us to gauge your level of familiarity with it. And finally, the third question is, are you concerned about wildfire risk or land management practices? It's kind of depending on where you are located in the county, your risk level of concern may differ. So it looks like we have just a little over half of participants who have responded. Give it just another few seconds here before we close the poll. All right. So for question 1, it looks like most of our participants today do live or work in a high wildfire risk area. In terms of familiarity with wildfire regulations, it looks like the majority or half understand most wildfire regulations or are confident in the knowledge of wildfire regulations. And then in terms of concern, majority of you are concerned about wildfire risk or land management practices, and likely hence your participation in today's meeting, which we really appreciate. Alrighty. And with that, next slide, I'm going to hand it over to Scott to discuss the Community Wildfire Protection Plan.
Okay, thank you, Twee. So thanks everyone for being here today. So the next few slides, we're going to look at generally what a community wildfire protection plan is. These plans were identified initially in the 2003 Healthy Forest Restoration Act, and they're intended to be a collaborative plan for communities that were at risk of wildfire and how they could identify, prioritize, and implement projects that could reduce the risk to their communities. So these plans identify and prioritize areas for fuel reduction treatments, and they recommend measures for reducing structural ignitability. We'll talk in subsequent slides about some of the plan content as well, but another one of the key components to these plans is a description of the fire environment that exists in the community and around the community. And then regarding a community wildfire protection plan versus a countywide CWPP, CWPPs can vary in scale quite a bit. They can be prepared for a small scale at the neighborhood scale, as well as up to a countywide scale, which we're talking about here today. Next slide, please. And so the purpose of this plan is to enhance community wildfire preparedness and protection by identifying fire hazard risk reduction strategies that also consider sustainable ecological management and fiscal resources. Next slide. So I think it's also important to point out, while we're talking about what is included and what a CWPP is, it's important to note that, as the call out box here on the slide states, that the CWPP is an educational tool that makes recommendations, but does not commit an agency or the public, for that matter, to a specific course of action. And so, a CWPP is not a decision document. It's not a regulatory document. It's not a vegetation management plan. It's not an environmental review or analysis document. And it's not a project under CEQA, which is the California Environmental Quality Act. Next slide, please. So regarding the countywide CWPP, just some information here to set the stage for this plan. The plan area covers the unincorporated portions of Los Angeles County. As you can see on the map here, that's the area shaded in green. And that covers over 1.6 million acres and just over half of the county, 54%. Next slide. And one of the important things that a CWPP does is to evaluate the factors that contribute to wildfire hazard. And so, as you can see on the diagram here, some of the main drivers affecting potential fire is weather, topography, and fuel. And some of the bullet items we see on the left here are some of the specific variables in Los Angeles County. So the Mediterranean climate present in the county obviously is a contributing factor to fire hazard. And, of course, the seasonal Santa Ana winds that occur are certainly a driving force behind some of the larger fires that have burned in the county. There's quite a variety and variability in vegetation types across the county, with dominant vegetation types being chaparral, grassland, and woodlands. There's a number of significant topographic features that are affecting the fire environment in the county. For example, the San Gabriel, Sierra Pelona, and Santa Monica Mountains. And then while Santa Ana winds are certainly a factor in some of the larger fires that have burned in the county, there are other conditions under which damaging and potentially damaging fires can burn. In diurnal wind conditions, which would, another term for that might be just your standard or typical weather conditions with more of an onshore flow from the ocean, as well as fires that are driven primarily by vegetation and less affected by wind. Next slide, please. So for the purposes of the countywide CWPP, the county was divided into 5 forecast zones. Those are shown on the map here on the right. We have the Antelope Valley, High Country, Santa Clarita Valley, Los Angeles Basin, and Santa Monica Mountains forecast zones. These zones originated in the wildfire risk analysis or wildfire risk assessment that was conducted kind of in the initial stages of this plan development. And really, these boundaries were drawn and were actually influenced by, with input from Los Angeles County Fire to sort of break the county into more, I guess, representative pieces. The county is pretty diverse in terms of vegetation and climate, and so conducting hazard assessment and plan development at a countywide scale, it made more sense to break the county into these pieces where the fire environments differ from each other. So that distinction into the 5 forecast zones is carried through into the CWPP. Next slide. And so just a general overview of what a CWPP would include: an introduction, a description of the plan area, a description of the planning and regulatory environment, and then a more detailed discussion at the forecast zone level of the fire environment. So that's everything from fire history, terrain, vegetation, weather, the results of the wildfire risk analysis, and then specific identified and recommended actions and priorities to that zone. Next slide. Okay, so we have another poll for the attendees today. We'd love your input on. The first question here is, which of these fire retrofits exist on your home or place of work? There's a number of options there. And then the second question is, which of these do you do for your yard? So these are specific to the area outside of your house, within proximity to your house in respect to vegetation management. And Twee, hopefully you can help me see where we are in terms of responses.
Absolutely. We are about, we have about half who have responded thus far.
Okay.
So we'll give it just a little more time as people are reading through the options here. Alrighty, we're almost there. Just a couple more seconds and I'll go ahead and close the poll. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results.
Okay.
Are you able to see the poll results there?
I can see them, yeah. Looks like we have pretty even distribution on the first question in terms of different actions that folks are taking on their homes. It looks like for the most part, people are taking some sort of action. We only had a few that haven't implemented any of those options that we had. And then it looks like the first option for question number 2, cleaning, dead, dry leaves and maintaining the exterior, then the first 30 feet is being done by looks like at least 3/4 of the attendees. So this is great. Thank you.
Wonderful. That takes us towards the end of our presentation and discussing our next steps. So this roadmap here gives you a visual of where we are in the entirety of the process, really not just the countywide CWPP, but more so the integrated wildfire safety program. There were a number of technical documents that we're having to draft. And as I mentioned, for example, with the WRA or the Wildfire Risk Assessment, there's modeling that is included. And so that's what we've been working on in the last several months, as well as drafting the Unified Land Management Plan, which is a tool for the county. And we've been partnering with the Technical Advisory Committee with land managers from the federal and the state level as well too, in order to craft that document. Here we are at the community document level, which is a countywide CWPP, and we're beginning that process now. We're developing an outline, but also soliciting information from community members, and today's informational session sets the stage for that. The entirety of the Integrated Wildfire Safety Program is funded by a grant by the state, or rather partially funded by a grant. So we are moving expeditiously forward. And you might wonder what, in terms of the countywide CWPP, there are some CWPPs that already exist. And I'll get into that in a little bit and what happens to those. And we'll discuss that in more detail in the forthcoming workshops as well too. But just wrapping up the discussion on the CWPP roadmap and the next steps. The next meetings, we're conducting outreach for the CWPP, and so there will be additional meetings that will be scheduled, and emails that will be distributed and information posted on the project website. If you are not yet on our listserv for this particular project, please do send us an email to safety@planning.lacounty.gov. That information will be posted in the next slide, where you will be able to ask to be placed on that, so that it ensures that you receive all future notices regarding this particular project, as well as upcoming meetings. After we conduct this initial community outreach, we will be collecting that information to draft the countywide CWPP, and there will be additional workshops after a draft is completed, and we'll be soliciting public comment on the draft as well too before we finalize it. So while step 4 is the only one that is identified as community outreach, there really are additional community outreach steps between steps 5 and 6, and likely between 6 and 7 as well too. So as mentioned, this really is a community-driven document, and your participation really will make for a much more complete document. And so we'll be coming out back to you a number of times. Next slide. As I mentioned, we do have some future workshops that will be highly interactive, that are scheduled for this summer starting on July 27th. As Scott had mentioned, our unincorporated areas are divided into wildfire forecast zones. Just given how large our county is, it made sense to be able to focus on these specific regions. So our first meeting is being kicked off for the Santa Monica Mountains on July 27th at 5:30 p.m. The meetings will run about an hour long, starting with a presentation followed by the interactive component, where we will be asking for specific information. The next meetings are scheduled for the Antelope Valley on August 3rd, Santa Clarita Valley on August 10th, the Los Angeles Basin on August 17th, and the High Country area on August 24th. The map that was shown on a previous slide showing those forecast areas and to be able to determine which meeting to attend is also available on the project website. So you can take a closer look at it to see if you may be on the border of one or the other, to help you determine which is the more closely related forecast zone for you to attend. And also at this meeting, as you leave today's meeting, as you're prepping for these next workshops, we do ask that you think about, and as you're driving around, observing the vegetative fields in your community and taking a look at areas where there may be areas of concern, or that there are areas where you think could use vegetative fields management. Because we will be asking you those questions at these future workshops. And there will be opportunities for you to send us photos as well too, for that to be included in the mapping exercise. Next slide. So between now and the next workshops, we do have a survey that is available on the project website. It was also sent out to the listserv. And the questions in the survey provides us with a kind of a baseline of where the community members may be. Some community members may be newer residents to the area and may not be as familiar with all of the best management practices, and some may have lived in the area for quite a bit of time and may be more familiar, or may have experienced wildfires in the community. So you definitely have great recommendations based upon experiences that you've had with wildfire. So we appreciate your participation in that survey. Next is to join the surveys themselves. Please do register at the website so that we know which meetings you will be attending. And then if you have any comments, please do send us comments at safety@planning.lacounty.gov. At this time, I think the next slide, maybe we'll leave it on this slide so you can jot down the information, but we do have time available for the questions and answers. I'm going to go back up to the list here.
Thanks, Tui. I also want to let you know that we put the links in the chat for people to easily access there. Everyone has access to those.
Perfect. Thanks so much. I have a question here. What exactly are wildfire regulations? Are we talking about vegetation clearances? We're talking generally, more broadly and generally about wildfire regulations. So things that are required as a part of development. So for example, the fire department requires fuel modification. So fuel modification zones between A, B, and C. So those mean you are required to do certain vegetative treatments on your property within those specific zones, but then also vegetation best management practices or home hardening practices that may not be required as a part of development regulations, but are suggested as good things to do to really help to harden the home and protect against wildfire. The next question is whether or not this project will drive new ordinances. No, a community wildfire protection plan isn't intended to drive new ordinances. As Scott mentioned, it identifies strategies and opportunities for community members. But also, as I believe Ryan had noted, one of the other participants at today's meeting, the Community Wildfire Protection Plan has a particular structure that is developed from the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. And so when it is developed in compliance with that structure and that process, it allows for grant funding opportunities to actually address and execute those vegetation management suggestions or recommendations that are found in the CWPP. And yes, also for the creation of fire safe councils. So the unincorporated area is quite a large area, and not all areas of the county have a fire safe council representation, or there are communities that may not be as organized through community organizations such as neighborhood councils or town councils, or any other type of council that assembles people together or creates a place for which people can congregate and organize and really rally around some of these topics such as wildfire. So the countywide CWPP allows for us to set that framework for particularly for communities that have not organized so that they do have a platform to build off of. And Ryan has provided a link to the Santa Monica Mountain CWPP. Thank you so much. We have a question. Could you provide source documents list that inform your work on the CWPP? We certainly can on the project website. We will do that and additional informative links. We have a question here. Are you working with SCE to improve fire risk safety due to their equipment? We can certainly have that conversation in the next series of workshops, that cross collaboration and relationship between the utilities and the vegetation management. We won't get into deep discussion here, but SCE is required to manage vegetation around their utility by the CPUC. The question is, will this video be available online for later viewing? Yes, this meeting is being recorded, and it will be placed on the project website for future viewing for those who were unable to attend today. Another question we have is, will the CWPP look at emergency evacuation concerns, such as whether communities have more than one evacuation route? Scott, can you remind me if specifically evacuation and evacuation routes is one of the components that we'll be addressing in the CWPP?
Yeah, thanks. We do typically address evacuation concerns in the CWPP. The document itself is not an evacuation plan, but if there are those concerns and if evacuation is an issue in a certain part of the county, the CWPP can recommend projects or actions to further analyze and I guess develop an evacuation plan or maybe enhance existing evacuation routes or something like that.
Thanks, Scott.
Yep.
And to add to that, the updated safety element does speak briefly to evacuation routes. It was one of the requirements for the update to the safety element. And our Office of Emergency Management does manage emergency response plans, such as evacuation concerns. So we will discuss that in more detail at the future workshops. And then the next question, will clearances be differently treated in SCAs, or is that addressed in the SCA implementation plan and outside the scope of the CWPP? So our significant ecological areas ordinance is a biological resource protection ordinance. It does address to a smaller degree some of these things that we'll be discussing. It doesn't specifically address wildfire, but it does address fuel modification requirements and such. So it's a little more nuanced and slightly outside the scope of the CWPP, but there is opportunity for the discussions in the workshops of that relationship of how we best manage our biological resources while still addressing fuel modification or vegetation management to protect communities from wildfire. Another question we have is that with about 50% of fires that LA fire departments respond to, what measures are included to mitigate homeless encampments as the source of human-caused fires? That's a little outside of the scope of this particular conversation, but I think there may be some opportunity for us to speak more holistically about that, of the source of fires. Typically with these plans, we're a little more focused on the fuels management of it, but certainly we can discuss that and see what suggestions we can come up with, and where those recommendations would be best housed for us to take action on it. Another question I have is, would you consider an additional date community meeting to address the scope of the large Los Angeles region? Los Angeles region has such as a large and densely populated footprint where foothill communities have similar conditions different than the lower lying areas could make for a more meaningful community engagement. We do have those 5 different geographically based meetings scheduled now. If we find that during those meetings, the time that has been allotted is not sufficient, then we certainly can come back out to the communities for additional input, or seek additional ways for that dialogue to continue, particularly for those who may not be able to join us at the time slot that had been scheduled. So thank you for that comment. And finally, will the CCWPP include fuel load? 2, will it include infrastructure such as utilities, information in relation to wildfires? We do have some information within, let me roll it back here. I'm actually going to ask Scott. I think in our WRA, we don't necessarily address the risk from utilities such as utility lines, but maybe Scott, if you can maybe fill in that information.
Sure, I'll do my best to interpret number 1 here. Will it include fuel load? The WRA, the risk assessment that we conducted, does include, one of the variables that it does include is vegetation type or fuel type, and corresponding fuel model and fuel load information is built into that. So I hope that answers that initial question. And will it include infrastructure information in relation to wildfires? The risk model doesn't look at the risk of fire to utilities specifically, but it does, I guess it does make an assumption that fires would occur. So I'm not sure if that's answering that question either, but one of the things we are in the process of looking at is the results of that assessment as it relates to the location of infrastructure. So the CCWPP would include information about utilities that are, I guess you could say, located in higher fire hazard areas in the county.
Thanks, Scott.
Yeah.
Really, really great questions from all of the participants today, and I appreciate that, and it makes me excited for the upcoming workshops that we'll be having, because it's telling that our conversations will be very, very exciting, and certainly very important as well too, as we move forward, and also to better protect the communities as the wildfire season extends longer and longer. So with that, we don't have any more questions. We really appreciate your time. Before you go, however, we do have just a couple of closing questions that will help inform future meetings to make sure that it is useful to you, and that we are maximizing the time that we have. We really appreciate your participation. The 2 questions here are, was the meeting useful to you, and was the information presented too much, not enough, or just right? And with that, as you're finishing up those questions, again, thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you at the workshops, and certainly feel free to reach out to us at any time regarding the project at safety@planning.lacounty.gov. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.